Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the monthly Night with the Experts program. This is a monthly program sponsored by Nuclear Energy Information Service in Chicago, where we bring experts on nuclear issues from around the country, sometimes around the world, to you, so you will have an opportunity not only to hear what they have to say, but hopefully an opportunity for you to ask questions and engage in dialogue with these people. Mostly in the past, it seems we have brought to you various technical experts, scientists and people who understand the geekiness of the nuclear industry. But I think when we do that, we forget that nuclear power and nuclear weapons is not a scientific issue. It's more than that. There's a human component to it that we frequently ignore. My friend and colleague Norma Fields from the University of Chicago asks the question constantly, where are the people? Well, tonight you are really in for a treat because you're going to find out where the people are. I'm particularly thrilled and pleased with this Night with the Expert because it reunites me with an old friend and activist colleague from about 3 or 4 lifetimes ago, Beka Economopoulos. I first met Beka as a student, when she was a student, that is, at Northwestern University. And her career has taken her to groups like HERG and Greenpeace and Student Environmental Action Coalition and a whole bunch of others, which you will hear about in a few minutes when she fills in the blanks when I let her go. So thank you for coming tonight. I think you're in for a real treat. And we're going to explore those other aspects that are just as important about nuclear power as the science and the technology stuff. Where are the people? Beka, I'll let you tell them where the people are. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Dave. Hi, everybody. It's great to be here with you tonight, and I think it's appropriate that I'm joining you from my childhood bedroom because I'm visiting my mom on the East Coast, and I feel like I've known Dave since I was a kid, and he was really my first mentor in activism and was very instrumental in getting me on this path. So thank you, Dave, and thanks to everybody for showing up. I am a longtime activist organizer who has been collaborating over the last couple decades with artists and cultural producers, scholars, frontline communities, and others. And I'm going to tell you today about work that I've done with a collective I co-founded back in 2004 called Not an Alternative. We're a collective that works at the intersection of art, activism, critical theory, and in 2014, we launched a project called the Natural History Museum. So I'd love to share my screen, show you some pictures, and run through some case studies that perhaps illuminate some principles of art, organizing, narrative change, culture change work. Okay. All right, everyone can see? Fabulous.
Good.
All right. Yeah, we launched the Natural History Museum in 2014 as a sort of traveling museum for the movement, we call it. The impetus was at the time our art activism collective had been enmeshed in community-led campaigns and social movements, supporting through developing visuals and creative interventions and videos. We also ran an event space with panel discussions and artist talks and film screenings. We were very involved in the Occupy movement. And all of this was a labor of love on the side of full-time organizing jobs. In the midst of the Occupy movement, I gave birth in a taxi cab. And my daughter became the labor of love. So I had to that was like a judgment point where we asked ourselves, what do we want our lives to look like? Do we choose stability and maybe give up on our crazy unfunded dreams? Or do we choose precarity and raise our kid up with our convictions and values intact? So we chose precarity, and this became our first full-time thing. We quit our day jobs, and a few climate campaigning organizations had reached out to ask if we would do some fee-for-service work around after Hurricane Sandy in New York City, targeting David Koch as New York City's wealthiest person and a top funder of climate denial campaigns. They thought it would be funny to run a campaign calling on him to foot the bill for hurricane cleanup. We couldn't really figure it out as we dug into research on whether or not to take the gig, exactly how it was funny or what role we could play. But we did learn that David Koch sat on the board of New York's American Museum of Natural History, one of our country's largest and most influential institutions of science and education and natural history. And that this also was a problem of the fossil fuel and polluting industry embedding in educational and cultural spaces as funders, as board members, et cetera, in ways that can lead to self-censorship, such that these institutions are not really reevaluating their roles in the ways that they need to be in the context of the multiple overlapping crises that we face. So how do you get a $13 million donor off the board? And pretty powerful guy. You can't bike lock yourself to the entrance and imagine that that's gonna win. So we employed instead a Trojan horse strategy and started a museum to get inside the sector and try to change it from within. We figured as artists, we have the skills to be believable as a museum on the cheap with graphic design. And as you saw here, a former airport shuttle bus that we got is a total clunker, broke down 1 million times, but was really more of a prop than anything else. And we had our first exhibition at the Queen's Museum, timed to coincide with a big 2014 climate march. And programming there, where we sort of created a museum within a museum as a stage set and backdrop for panel discussions with climate justice activists, historians, scientists, and others. We also teamed up with scientists around the world, a number of Nobel laureates, to release a letter calling on museums to cut all ties to fossil fuel interests. And I'll say in years and years of doing activism, this by far was the most viral thing I'd been involved with hundreds of news hits around the world and hitting different beats, right? Not just the usual suspects of environment or science. It was higher education and art and culture and so on. And so it seemed to kick off some sector-wide soul searching. Our interest was in sort of modeling the museum of the future from a position of within, so that we could, almost like a union organizing strategy, identify our closeted radicals or at least allies on the inside who are sympathetic to what we were urging museums to do, which is to say, to take a position on the right side of history. And because of the press coverage, we heard from folks at the American Alliance of Museums and the Center for the Future of Museums. And they said, you know, you're raising issues that we're encouraging museums to grapple with regard to ethical funding and climate change and so on. And so we asked him, well, can we park outside your annual convention and with our bus and show a bunch of videos we'd shot with luminaries from different disciplines that and backgrounds that are important to the museum. And they said, yeah, no, I don't think that's going to work. And we're like, we'll park outside. And they're like, well, there's a taxi zone there. I don't think there's anywhere for you to park. Why don't you park on the exhibition floor and exhibit there? We're like, this is a spit and duct tape operation. We do not have money for an exhibitor space. And let's just say they gave us a mouth dropping good smacking good deal. We had a space that was 9 times larger than the American Museum of Natural History's and right next to theirs. So we took the opportunity to recreate dioramas and installations from the American Museum of Natural History, but to insert David Koch and their sponsor in some way into the equation. So here's sort of dystopic future dinosaur hall, which is sponsored by Koch at the American Museum of Natural History, where you see a skeleton contemplating an Allosaurus skull. And the question, will the story of the sixth max extinction ever include the role of its sponsors? And this diorama is actually a pretty cool one. The museum had hosted a climate change exhibition a few years prior. Our friend and core collective member happened to work at the American Museum of Natural History, so he was kind of privy to the response that some folks had, and there were pieces of the exhibit that took an industry stance, or that was kind of in line with the sponsors that people who saw it in advance of the opening did raise critiques, and the museum did change the exhibit a bit. Overall, it's good, but still not like where we need them to be. But this was by far a favorite diorama. There was a polar bear atop the detritus of kind of urban waste and a polar ice cap. But we thought it would be better if it had a Koch Industries pipeline and spill in there, as you see. So there is more to this, but I'll say that by and large, we saw it as a stage set, as a backdrop for having dozens and dozens of conversations with people in this sector to understand their points of pain, their aspirations, their, where are things at, to get a lot of contact information and signatures and so on. And so that, we kind of went deep in that strategy, showing up to different conventions. And I joined the Association of Science Museum Directors. I love how Dave introduced me. He's like, usually we have geeks who understand things, but tonight we have Beka. Anyway, that's how I felt. That's how I felt crashing the annual retreat of science museum directors. I was so nervous, but I had in poking around online found a website that looked like it was built in 1993, like a dot matrix font or something, and it said, to become a member, just fill out this form and send in a $50 check. So I did. And I was a member, and that qualified me to go to their retreats. So this is me at the first one in Vancouver with other museum directors, and I call this museum directors in their natural habitat. But I wasn't there to be a jerk, right? It built genuine relationships and really to understand the vocabulary and the culture at the decision-making level, so that we could choreograph you know, an interplay of inside and outside strategies to accelerate change. We also, on the time of the Paris Climate Summit, raised funds because there were a number of other artist collectives and creative activists around the world who were targeting museums in their home countries for fossil fuel sponsorship. And we'd never all, like each of us had gotten a lot of press coverage of our respective efforts, but it hadn't been like packaged as this growing movement. And it felt like, you know, what we were trying to do in initiating this was take a page from the tobacco playbook, where, you know, we had a pretty robust fossil fuel divestment movement, but it had not entered the cultural sphere. Also, we know that without shifting the culture, policy rolls back and the pendulum swings and so on. So we brought everybody together in Paris to have our first retreat in face-to-face to launch the fossil-free culture movement or museum liberation movement. So this is us plotting and scheming, and we also put together our first collaborative intervention during the climate summit at the Louvre. You can see here. So we came back and we worked with 350.org and other folks and continued to push museums, and the dominoes started to fall. So we started to hear from different museums about divesting or dropping fossil fuel sponsors, and we got Coke off the board. 552,000 petition signatures and lots of other tactics and strategies in between. So about a dozen museums. That was great, monumental, but for us, this is what we understood as our shit disturbing phase, I call it. Pardon for the any kids in the room. It was a provocation really intended to sort of call out or call in our allies in this sector. So that we, you know, really can be more effective at not just institutional, but sector-wide change. And then a fast forward, we started to do sanctioned exhibitions inside museums, not just unauthorized ones. This was in Houston. We were working with an environmental justice community there, or a community of low income, largely undocumented Latinx immigrants living next to the second largest petrochemical complex in the world, where there's no zoning regulations and homes are like in the shadow of refineries and kissing chemical tanks. And we were trying to decide with this exhibition opportunity, we had actually an art venue, or art museum in Houston, what to do. And we decided, after visiting the Houston Museum of Natural Sciences with them, that we wanted to dedicate our exhibition, transform the space into a natural history museum with an exhibition called, no, I don't have it here, Mining the Houston Museum of Natural Sciences. So we asked the question, like, is the Houston Museum of Natural Sciences a museum or a propaganda machine for industry? I will put in the chat after this a link to video that I invite you to see about that exhibit. It was really fun to work on. It was also a bit of a pivot point for us, where we'd been focused so much on the critique. And in this case, half of the exhibition was a bit of a slam on the Houston Museum. And I'll say that this wasn't our normal MO, but I felt vindicated when the Association of Science Museum Directors, actually on one of our retreats, went to Houston and took a tour of the museum, and the several of the other directors said, "Wow, you're right." So yeah, the second half of that exhibition space was really focused on modeling. Okay, what does it look like for a museum to be an apparatus for environmental justice movements? And so we worked on some air quality monitoring studies and kind of lifting up members of Tejas through these mini hologram projection dioramas where they gave one of their toxic tours. And then Standing Rock happened. And we had done a lot of work with scientists, including co-organizing the March for Science on every continent. It was pretty amazing because scientists are a constituency whose ways of knowing and knowledge are in natural history museums. And they are important to natural history museums. So mobilizing them made a lot of sense. Going to a lot of museum conferences and conventions, we found also that Indigenous communities are an important constituency to museums. And museums, as you probably know, have a very checkered past and in many cases present with regard to their relations with Indigenous communities, the theft of objects, the kind of complicity in the colonial agenda. And so, but there are a lot of really amazing folks working in these places who are trying to redress historical harms and kind of reinvent the museum. And because of our work, we had a lot of relationships with folks in historic preservation and archaeology and anthropology and so on. So when Standing Rock happened and it kind of horrified folks around the world, it felt like history was repeating and off the pages of the history book and playing out again in front of our eyes, but maybe this could be different, the outcome this time, right? We had friends in the tribe and at the Tribal Historic Preservation Office reached out and said, hey, can you organize your people? We're like, we're hacks. We're not, they're not really museum people or archaeologists or anthropologists or anything. And we keep hearing that the excuse of, we're neutral. But we're like, if ever there were a time, particularly with the bulldozing of sites sacred to the tribe by the pipeline company, now would be the time for them to speak up. And so we started a solidarity letter and had no idea how that would go, but within a few days had 1,400 museum directors, archaeologists, anthropologists, and historians signed on. That was covered in New York Times and a bunch of other outlets. And the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer said, one of the things, we may have lost the pipeline fight for now. One of the things we gained is a set of powerful new allies. It was not too long thereafter that, we started to get invitations to do exhibitions inside major museums. And we reached out to folks over at the Lummi Nation who had been fighting North America's second largest proposed coal export terminal in Washington State, which was slated to be sited atop an ancestral village. And they have been for about 20 years now, the House of Tears Carvers of the Lummi Nation and Tribal Sovereignty and Protection Office have been carving a series of totem poles, putting them on the back of a flatbed truck and driving them to different communities, for example, along the coal train route to transcend NIMBYism, holding local events that could turn out farmers and ranchers and faith communities and environmentalists and tribal folks for programs and ceremony. People were invited to lay hands on the pole at each stop and pray on the pole. And let me talk about it as like it's like a battery that charges along its route. And if you talk to the Sierra Club out in the Pacific Northwest, they will say it was the totem pole journeys that defeated the Cherry Point coal port terminal. There was an international conference of museum directors at the Carnegie Museum of Natural History in Pittsburgh, which is in the middle of coal and fracking country. We had befriended the director there, and he invited us to speak, and we were like, well, what if we do an exhibit? And that kind of snowballed into this, where he said, I can't really talk about fossil fuels in my institution when half my board got wealthy off of them. Their cafe is called Fossil Fuels Cafe or something like that, Fossil Fuel Cafe. And we were like, yeah, but you can host a totem pole that is sort of a monument to resistance to fossil fuels. And sure enough, that we did. And so since then, we've done a number of exhibitions and projects with alumni, not just to kind of get these stories into museums, but more, thinking strategically about timing and locations and how this can connect to active community-led campaigns. When, for example, the COVID pandemic hit and those institutions were closed, we fabricated an outdoor sort of IMAX style wraparound venue that could travel and for outdoor exhibitions with a film there, and to support the campaign to take down the Snake River dams and restore the salmon and the orcas. And we also worked with alumni and a number of other partners to organize a coast-to-coast Washington State to DC totem pole journey for the protection of sacred places, visiting 17 different tribal communities across the country with events. And it ended you can see some photos there. It ended in Washington, D.C. with a rally on the National Mall, and Secretary of the Interior Deb Haaland received the totem pole and met with tribal leaders. And then the exhibition was featured in the Smithsonian through the summer. And so that's a sort of historic tour. The last thing I'd like to show you is this new work that we are that we're focused on now. And it's very close to my heart. It's called We Refuse to Die. Our friends' homes burned down in 2020 in Oregon. About 20 homes burned down in the wildfires there, and they now live in the apartment above our garage. We went out with them earlier this year to salvage trees that had been killed in the wildfires, and we've been carving them into different human and other animal forms of the living dead. And over the next few years, working with communities in the Pacific Northwest, Appalachia, the Gulf South, Permian Basin, we are planting these carvings in the ground as permanent monuments oriented to face petrochemical plants, nuclear sites, false solutions to the climate crisis like LNG export terminals and fracking and so on. We also it just closed, but this fall the project launched with an exhibition at the Carnegie Museum of Art this time. And these are community partners in Texas and Louisiana and Pennsylvania and Ohio and beyond. These were just temporary on bases filming for the exhibition. So we just had our first planting ceremony or first installation of what's called an externality monument. And you will hear in this video an explanation. You are about to see members of communities across the country in Texas and Louisiana and Mississippi and West Virginia and Virginia who are carrying this externality carving to plant it permanently in the ground facing the U.S. Steel Coke Works plant, the #1 industrial air polluter in Allegheny County, which is in the top 1% of counties nationwide for cancer risk from industrial air pollution. And I just got an alert on my phone today, actually, about air quality here in Clairton. We are right now breathing the #1 worst air in the country. And there is wildfire smoke that is blanketing the country today. In 2020, our friends' homes burned down in the wildfires out near where we live. In the Pacific Northwest, there were about 20 homes that burned down. And we went out with them earlier this year to salvage trees that had been killed in the wildfires. And we have been carving them into human and other animal forms of the living dead. And the idea is if the fossil fuel and petrochemical industries are writing off our frontline communities as sacrifice zones, as externalities, a word industry uses to describe the cost of doing business that don't show up on their economic ledgers. They are paid for by the people, by the land, and by our children's future. If they are writing us off as the living dead with "We refuse to die, the living dead speak back," by forging a coalition between the living and the dead, in which the ancestors are not simply victims, they are allies and agents of change.
Thank each and every one of you for being here. This opportunity for me to have this externality carving in my yard was a way to gather our community and encourage them to speak to the many injustices that start with this industry. They pretend as if the air doesn't hurt. Our mayor says that's just steam, and it's a lie. I buried my father in 2013, my mother 6 months later, my sister in 2015, my baby brother in 2020. It's time that we come together and realize the destruction and the pain is experienced by all of us, and there is no sitting defense. There is only telling the truth, and the truth is pollution kills, capitalism kills. I am now the last living immediate relative of this family, and I will not let them take my land. I will not let them tell my story, and I will not let them take my history. This statue will be here. It is not moving. It will not be removed. And I want you all to remember, we refuse to die. Can you say that with me? We refuse to die.
So our next planting ceremony, and we also cast masks, as you can see, from the carvings. thinking about this as a sort of narrative and visual framework and resource for movement organizing. You can imagine going into public hearings where they're silencing community and, you know, putting the externality mask on. This is a family who, you can see the train line. This is their backyard, and almost exactly 1 year ago, they watched a train engulfed in flames careen through their yard before derailing less than 2 miles down the road. So on February 3rd, next week, our next permanent installation of an externality monument will take place in Clairton, Pennsylvania, in East Palestine, Ohio, working with residents in the Unity Council there. And these are some images from the exhibition where we can continue to leverage museums to reach new audiences, but also these are stills from the film and the exhibit. Also, you know, really use this in the context of campaigns. Around the launch last fall, there was an industry summit in Pittsburgh that was sponsored by Norfolk Southern, the train company behind the derailment, and US Steel, the company whose Coke Works plant is in Clairton. So those were the two sponsors. So we took the opportunity to take out digital billboards across the street, calling out industry, and had great TV coverage on the nightly news on that. We also ran billboards in the communities for earned media, and then we had a convening with 30 collaborators from community folks from the Gulf South and Appalachia and beyond, which was pretty beautiful. It was really focused on forging family and building the durable bonds that really are needed to sustain the Davids fighting the Goliaths in these times that we face. So I will close there, and I'm sorry that was totally way longer than Dave told me I had, so.
Well,
I didn't want you to stop, so there you
I'm almost speechless on that, but thank you for a wonderful presentation. I didn't mean to leave you out of the club of geekdom earlier, but you're a geek of a different type. And the important thing is that you bring the message of humanity, and that's frequently absent from all of these political meetings, all of the hearings of the legislators, all of the industry of whatever. You bring heart and soul back to it, and I thank you for that.
Thank you, Dave.
Well,
yeah, okay, go ahead. You made me think of something I'd love to respond, but I have just done a lot of talking, so we'll open the floor.
Okay. Let me give a little instruction, and then we'll turn it over to my colleague, Jan Budart. First of all, I want to welcome, excuse me, I notice that tonight we have many new people who we've never seen before. I want to welcome you all tonight with the Experts, which is a monthly program from NEIS. And I'm really glad that you came to this particular presentation, because I think it takes us in a direction as a movement of all kinds of movements that frequently gets forgotten. And this is a way to show where our power is as a movement. So welcome. We hope you'll come back next month. What we do now is turn it over to you pretty much. Night with the Experts is set up so that you will have access to experts and geeks. So you get the opportunity to ask questions, get into a little bit of dialogue, cross dialogue as well. I'm going to enable the chat function. And if you don't want to ask a question, or if you have links that you would like to share, put that in the chat. We will send the chat around later to those who participated. And in a moment, I'm going to let Jan explain how we operate the next portion of the meeting, which should go for the next hour, maybe longer. We'll see. So again, thank you, Beka. And now I'm going to turn it over to Jan Budart, who is a board member of NEIS.
Thank you very much for the presentation, Beka. I was thrilled to, it's hard to imagine all this going on when we didn't know about it until now. I don't know how that happened. So we have a few rules. One is that you may ask one follow-up question when Beka answers your question, but not two. And if you want to ask a question later on when you've already asked one, you'll be called on if nobody else is is wanting to ask a question. So down at the bottom of your screen, there's a thing that says reactions. And if you click on that, there will be a bar that says raise hand. And this is what it looks like. I'll just put mine on. And this is really the easiest way for me to call on you because they come up on the screen in order of the people who raise their hands. Also, if you put your question in the chat, we'll definitely try to get to it. It's a kind of tricky to go between the screen and the chat, but we usually can manage that okay. I don't remember any of the other rules. I hope you will just simply respect the other participants here. And so I'm going to call on R.A. Rosenstein to ask their question. R.A. Rosenstein, please unmute and ask your question. Got her unmute.
Maybe while Ari's figuring that out, Linda's posted a question in the chat.
Okay. Okay, let's see. Okay, Linda, why don't you ask your question?
Well, I wrote it in the chat. Hi, Beka. That was terrific. Really opened a lot of new vistas and ideas. I wanted to know what, if anything, you've done in the area of nuclear and radioactive waste issues in your work, and what do you recommend? Have you given any thought to, things to do as well?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I actually started out in the nuclear space working at NEIS with Dave Kraft at a really exciting time when we were working with a whistleblower and going to public hearings and doing radio stuff, and Zion nuclear power plant was shut down. So gave me a taste of victory. Thank you, Dave. We have not worked directly on nuclear energy. However, we are interested in that. It has certainly kind of the crisis around that has escalated in the context of the climate solutions that are getting bandied about. And we've also met with folks in New Mexico and Arizona who are dealing on tribal lands with radioactive waste and explored possibilities for collaboration there. And I think that the We Refuse to Die campaign as a new multi-year project / campaign is a great avenue for us to engage the topic of nuclear.
Jan, you're on mute, just so you know.
But Rosenstein is not. So please ask.
I'm unmuted now.
Yes.
I think my question is related to the earlier one. Our leading climatologist, Dr. James Hansen, is promoting nuclear fission power as a green alternative to fossil fuels. But I've learned from this organization that you need a fossil fuel infrastructure to operate the nuclear fission power plants. How do we get that message out to the American people that nuclear fission power is not necessarily a green alternative to mitigating climate change?
Yeah, Thank you for that. There's a proliferation of what people are calling false solutions, including carbon capture and sequestration and hydrogen hubs and so on. These are untested, unproven, and unscalable technologies at the moment. And there are other solutions that are not loopholes or side doors for the fossil fuel industry to continue business as usual. And on our end, and we've written some kind of theory articles on this around movement practice and art and activism, around the power of organizing around symbols and names or phrases that hold us in common, so that we can. The Occupy movement was an example of this. It was a movement that was contested. Any symbol is, any name, when it starts to it kind of builds power, becomes contested. But too often in activism, we then dump it as controversial and start over from the beginning. Sometimes that makes sense, and sometimes the meaning of things is not fixed, and we should struggle over them because they have built up some currency, and it is really hard in this information age where there's a high static to noise ratio for us to penetrate. So one thing I would suggest is to consider kind of inserting the critique of nuclear fission into the false solutions framework, and explore partnerships or collaborations with folks who are organizing around the false solution framework. And in particular, there are a number in New Mexico and Arizona, like Pueblo Action Alliance and folks involved in the Climate Justice Alliance, who are fighting both fossil fuels and radioactive waste and uranium contamination under the framework of, or their communications campaign is around false solutions. So I think they'd probably be pretty amenable to incorporating nuclear fission critique.
Oh, just briefly, one aspect of your response to me concerned hydrogen. I've worked on hydrogen my whole adult life, and depending on how it's extracted and stored, it can be a very viable tool. It can also be dangerous if you extract it from fossil fuels, though. So how do we get out a message about hydrogen too, so it can be environmentally pliable in a way?
Yeah, hydrogen's such a wonky one because there's all these weird colors and they mean different things, right? There's pink hydrogen and blue hydrogen and gray hydrogen, and it all tells us, what is the hydrogen power derived from? Is it fracked gas or is it nuclear or what have you? I have been told by many folks I trust that there's no such thing as green hydrogen. I've also been told by other people I trust that there is. So I'm not really qualified to speak on that, but I will say that the facts and figures don't set you free. Like, we continue to try to campaign exclusively on educating people on the facts. And we know that story is how folks more naturally transmit information, and messengers matter. And as we're all about deconstruction and revealing the facts and pointing out the disinformation, breaking it all down, our opposition is building it up through myth, through story, that is not based in ethics or reality. But that does not mean that those tactics or strategies are inherently problematic. Our myth making, our stories need to be rooted in an ethics, but we need to be speaking to people in a way that, as Dave said, like engages their humanity. So I will say that, I've worked for environmental NGOs for decades, in organizing director and communication director positions. I have a ton of respect for the organizations I worked with and many others. And I feel like our summer site visits in the Gulf South and Appalachia, driving around with a U-Haul truck filled with these externality carvings and masks, meeting many people for the very first time, was transformative for me in ways that I was not anticipating at all. And it was not showing up as an NGO talking about carbon molecules in the atmosphere or policy or what's happening, to their water. I mean, that becomes a part of the conversation, but it's front loaded first and foremost with with like, what are you scared of? What are you dealing with? Like, grief comes up all the time, and I think we all have it, right? How could you not? So we need ways of metabolizing that grief into collective strength and community power. And we need ritual. We need ritual that allows us to do that without being hokey or forced. And the last thing I'll say on that is, this is what you had made me think about, Dave, is there was an article in, I think, The Atlantic last year that terrified me about the rise of the new right, and that there are these odd bedfellows in sort of new alignments that are forming that are not traditional kind of, left to right. It's really mixing it up. So you've got permaculture and back to the land folks who are and yoga people. I think the pandemic also like really made some people crazy. Joining with secessionists and so on. So the emphasis on the vaccines and masks freaked many people out, and now they're on the far right. Which isn't to say that we don't educate people about the science, but also we need to be talking about, the conversation we had when we showed up with these carvings were just immediately went to a deep place. And as a result, like, we're texting each other at 11 p.m. This isn't a campaign. Like, they're my family. And that's what we need to be doing, right? Because we're no longer organizing through the churches, really, right? We don't have infrastructure at scale that is speaking to people on their 360-degree holistic self, right? So we need to get out ahead of this, because there's people like Marjorie Taylor Greene and others who are speaking to people's existential fears and offering, the wrong solutions. So what do we do?
Thank you. Mavis Bates, will you please ask your question?
Hi, thank you. I have a feeling the answer to my question may be, it really doesn't matter, but I'm going to ask it anyway. I'm trying to understand environmental justice as best I can. And the way I understand it right now, it is a matter where terrible pollution, high cancer risk is combined with Black, Indigenous, people of color, and low income and disadvantaged people. So then I'm going to use an example of what happened in Downers Grove, Illinois. There was a lot of terrible cancer, multiple myeloma, because of this company. I've forgotten it over the last year, but they were using this terrible gas to sterilize medical equipment. Can we call that environmental justice if it's happening in a white middle class neighborhood? If it doesn't matter, I'll take that answer too.
There is a federal definition of environmental justice that is framed around the disproportionate burden that low-income communities and communities of color face around the siting of polluting infrastructure. So technically, that is the legal or government definition. And perhaps that's the answer. However, is there environmental injustice taking place there? 100%. 100%. And so, and I do think environmental justice also speaks to public health. So there, maybe that was.
Okay.
I think that problem that Mavis had in her neighborhood, because the people were middle class and they could fight it, they moved the factory up to Waukegan, where the people were less able to.
Yeah,
Anyway.
I'm in Aurora. I'm in King County, but my cousin died,
Oh, yeah.
and my nephew-in-law's father died. So there's two in our family who died in that town.
I'm
So
sorry.
that's terrible. Okay, thank you for that answer.
Okay, Evan Craig, go ahead, please.
Sure. So I was really impressed with the art.
Oh, yeah.
And I don't know whether you were the artist or had a great artist troupe, but it seemed to have seemed to pay homage to Native American art before the Dakota Access Pipeline campaign, I think. And so I think you were tapping into those roots, but I wanted to ask whether, because I think the intersection of art and environment, the way you did it, especially with the natural history theme, is really potent. And I'm wondering whether there are other cultural threads that you think might be pulled to contribute that nexus between art and environment.
Other threads to pull beyond like natural history as a
And the Native Americans. I mean, what other cultural legacies do we have that come to bear on this issue of
I see.
fairness?
Yes. Okay. Yeah. Well, you know, we've had the privilege of working with Indigenous team members in our collective, Indigenous collaborators and partners for the last, I don't know, 6, 8, 10 years. And also felt like there's so much there, so many lessons there that are relevant to movement building and this like commitment to history, to that which binds us together, to the power of materiality or symbols as these sort of vessels, right, to organize around, to hold people together. And the question is like, what do we have as non-Indigenous people, as settlers, as folks who, in many cases, for many of us, our ancestral heritage and ties are weak or non-existent. And that was a knot that we aim to crack, or at least like explore through We Refuse to Die. For this one, you know, for many years working with the Lummi and the House of Tears carvers, we were building exhibitions and projects and kind of, you know, around their art and lifting it up. And in this case, we're doing the carvings ourselves. and in the masks and so on. But in partnering with different communities around what those local ceremonies look like, that is where the history of place, culture, even if culture is there, is relatively recent, and there are practices or rituals that have currency in particular places or in particular communities. So, for example, in Clairton, it's a mostly Black community. And the woman we were working with was, very invested in her African American heritage and African ancestral heritage, and the ways in which those teachings and practices with regard to how we relate to the land and each other are ones that that she really wanted to uplift and and propel a resurgence of. And so at that ceremony, it was emceed by Archbishop Marcia Dinkins from Black Appalachian Coalition, who had a family emergency and her deputy took over. There was libation. There was West African drummers and dancers, or drumming and dancing, and music, like this teen sang the goodbye song from the movie Harriet, a song of liberation and civil rights. It was beautiful. It was really, really powerful. In Appalachia, and in East Palestine, we're looking at old time music and shape, what do they call it? Sacred harp singing or shape note singing.
Shape notes, yeah.
Yes, thank you. So, and it's up to the local community, but I would say there are absolutely ways of engaging and marshaling the power of culture and ritual and music and symbols in history.
Okay, thanks.
I don't see any other hands raised.
There is a question in the chat from Delia Barajas, if you want to take a look at that.
Okay. Delia? Oh, all right. Now, if Delia wants to read her question, please feel free, but I will go ahead and read it. I live in Cicero, Illinois, an environmental justice community, mostly immigrant community. We have Coppers, a coal tar facility, who has been in violation. We have the largest U.S. wastewater facility in Cicero. It's been difficult to have wins due to our paronage, loyal. Oh, it looks like she means patronage, loyal elected officials. Have you all worked in communities like Cicero? Since we are a grassroots community, we are a grassroots committee barely organizing. So she wants to talk about yeah. So okay.
You're not alone, Delia. That's the first thing I want to say. You're not alone. There are so many communities in that position, and you have family that you haven't met yet, who are leading these fights in other places too. The woman in Clairton, Pennsylvania, that we worked with, who spoke at the end of the video, is in the same boat that you are. It is not an organized community. It is an industry town. There are a lot of health impacts. And so there's sort of a cone of silence. And that is a refrain that we have heard from communities across the country. And so, in many of these places, environmental justice communities next to polluting infrastructure have been called sacrifice zones, or, I think a story, sort of a victimization. And key to our strategies around art activism is holding up a mirror to reflect back to the community a story of its own power or agency. And what can we do to give people that strength and that energy, and also resources and knowledge through building relationships and cross-pollination. So I think that's a big piece of it, is bringing together, like this convening in the fall. We brought together 30 folks from the Gulf South and Appalachia, a few who had met, most who hadn't. And I've never hosted or organized a convening like this, where there were not panel discussions. It was not a conference. It was entirely designed across 5 days around relationship building. And, we did toxic tours led by local residents and bus tours, and we had meals together, and it was powerful. And now they're all putting each other on Zoom panels and texting and sending holiday cards and et cetera. So you're not the only person who feels like they're the only person in the community. It is a big uphill battle to rally the troops, and you're not in it alone. And I very much recommend also looking into folks from other places that you can talk to.
And in fact, Dave put in the chat a suggestion for Delia, and it's a good one. Okay, our next questioner is Jackie. So Jackie, go ahead and ask your question, please.
Actually, it's not a question. It's just, I am so grateful that I got your email about coming to this event tonight. It is so fabulous. The intersection of people and art and feelings and community, and just empowering people to speak their piece to the powers that be that create such injustice. And the fact, Beka, that you've created this whole museum, this museum quality thing, this is just so astonishing. I'm a musician. My sister is an artist. We've both been involved in the arts worlds our whole lives, and this is just, it's just fantastic. So I wanted to thank you, and I'm hoping that this recording, that I might be able to share it with some of my friends who are also in Indigenous communities here near where I live. Is that going to be possible?
Yes.
Oh, that's great. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Jacqueline.
Jan, I muted you when the phone went off, so come off of mute, please. Craig, you're next. Hand up. Go ahead.
Beka, first of all, thank you very much for your presentation and the work that you've been doing. You had me in tears at different times, so
Yeah.
really appreciate it. I'm curious. I've been studying. Most of us, we struggle with the practicalities of living in our culture, where money really is central to, if you don't have money, you don't eat, you can't pay your rent. And so we go to work, often to jobs that are, soulless and, in service of making money. So I'm interested in, I got a lot of questions. Well, first of all, let's just start with you describe not an alternative as a collective. Maybe let's just start there. Tell me a little bit about how that's organized, or how people participate in that. And the struggle we have in West Michigan with our local nuclear power plant is time and energy, and where people, everybody's busy, and then at the end of the day they're worn out and they don't have time to be active or an activist, or
Yeah.
to try to speak out, or to even attend events and stand up and be counted. So, but tell me a little bit about Not an Alternative, and how that's organized and how you keep people involved with that.
Yeah. Yeah, well, we started out as more of a collective. I mean, we're a collective insofar as, well, I'll tell you about our origin story. In the kind of art activism, art and politics world that we kind of trafficked in, came out of, let's say, in New York City. We were based in New York for 20 years before moving to the Pacific Northwest. An art collective is like not an alternative, is the artist. So there's a bunch of us that are producing Not an Alternative, and there's a coherency and a consistency to what it is that Not an Alternative is aiming to say and what kinds of things it does, as if it were like an individual artist, but it is collectively produced. So we had a rotating cast of characters, but there's a few of us who have been there from the beginning, who are still with the collective. Along the way, we incorporated as a nonprofit in order to raise funds and tax deductible donations and so on. And when we launched the Natural History Museum as our first full-time project, we kind of shifted a bit more into that nonprofit organization model. But so there are like staff, and then we have a big network of collaborators that we work with on various projects in a more ad hoc way, if that answered your question.
Yeah, I guess so. Those two organizations you named are organized as a nonprofit, and so they're actually receiving donations or funding to help support paid staff, then you're saying?
Yeah. Yes. So in terms of like, how do we do this? Like, yes, we raise funds. We're a scrappy small nonprofit, but we have 4 staff. And then when we work with, we have a network of people we contract and pay. We have a number of fellows who are stipended. And then anytime we do anything with community folks, we offer honoraria,
Okay.
generous honoraria.
Okay. I'll let other people ask questions. Thank you.
I just want to say one thing about that is like, I feel like there is a very extractive model often in organizing where folks who are working multiple jobs don't have time to, show up, but have a story to tell and then get put in a press conference as a speaker and asked to do interviews, et cetera, and not compensated for that time. And that's something that we really need to change. So for us, it's supporting community members who are not getting paychecks to do the activism. If there's any investment in time, then ideally, resourced organizations need to be distributing those resources.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and somehow we need to get a soul back into all of our institutions. It seems that everything has become soulless. I mean, the for-profit corporations are terrible in that they have one motive, and that's the profit, and it's injured us all. And then in any case, so I thank you for your work.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you for your answer. Diane, please go ahead.
Hi, I'm Diane with Nuclear Information and Resource Service, and terrific story. So inspiring. So the content of the museum is mostly climate stuff. It's what's the content? It varies with each event that you're trying to get in on.
How do I answer that? We have a number of different programs that I didn't get into as well. So I think it's more like our partners are community collaborators. What are they dealing with? Where can we be a value add? With We Refuse to Die, we've kind of launched it in around petrochemicals and fossil fuels, but our vision for it is, that we can expand from there. The goal is, and I meant to say this when I was talking about sacrifice zones, is that the communities portrayed as victims, like we have to shift that narrative to communities as warriors, right? They're the front lines of defense, and they're like leading the struggle for all life on Earth. So the externality as a symbol is meant to be like a collective subject with agency. That the living dead is not just those who are being poisoned now, it's those we've lost and who came before us, whose legacies we're building on and shoulders we stand on. And it's those not yet born who are already dead, their futures are being foreclosed, right? This is the army, the coalition of the living dead, and we're showing up at your door. And we're not pretty, it's intense, right? But there's something powerful about that. So we envision that expanding even beyond the environmental space. We're dealing with, a migrant crisis. We're dealing with, and this is global, right? The position of the externality is, and any people for whom capitalism has excluded, for whom this system does not work. And that constituency is growing and growing. And so that is, and ultimately, that's how we're going to build power, is by recognizing it's not exclusively issue focused politics. We need to be experts and really focus on things. But from a movement perspective, we need to be connecting with other folks, with other concerns, recognizing that at the root, they are connected.
And then I'll just say that I was in Paris when the climate conference was happening, and tried to get into the Louvre. I don't know if it was just one day that you guys did your stuff there, or if it was over time, but it was a day that we had a banner like Dave has behind him on the, a nuclear power, no thanks banner, probably in French, maybe in English, in my backpack. And they went through the backpack and they wouldn't let us in because there was activism going on in the Louvre that day. And I thought, oh, that's good. I was happy, but I never knew who it was. And so nice to make the connection here tonight.
That's really funny. There were folks from our group who went in and spilled, it looked like oil on the floor and all over themselves. So there was a little direct action inside, and you might have been on the impacted end of that.
It was fine. It was great. Glad, that's what we were there for.
That's nice.
Thank you.
Dave, go ahead and ask your question, please.
Sure, thanks. Must have been about 10 or 15 years ago, you came to Chicago, I remember, to meet up with some other folks who were also discussing the intersection of arts and activism, and you met down in Bridgeport, I think it was. You came in winter, I remember that too. But you have taken a particular path of art and the way you use it. And my question is this, are you familiar with or could you direct folks even possibly to other arts that are also being used in this intersection? For example, I met a University of Chicago student a couple of years ago who was into designing games. And she said, games are the way into the young people. You design a game on this topic and it's open-ended and they learn and they share from each other. So that was one example. Manga is another, people might write mangas on certain things. So anyway, you get the idea that, I mean, I'm taking the big broad brush 18-inch roller size view of arts. And are you familiar with this kind of activism going on in the other arts?
Yeah, I mean, there's a ton of folks out there doing really amazing work that has activist import, and some are kind of more on the end of the spectrum as individual artists. This is their art practice, yet it is like they're producing powerful interventions. And then there's folks that are more like community-based artists or movement artists. I'm thinking about like Fabiana Rodriguez and Culture, I think it's called Culture Lab. I got to double check. And the Just Seeds collective that is largely graphic artists and illustrators who produce posters and for movements and campaigns. If you're interested, Creative Capital is an institution that supports folks a little more on the art end of the spectrum, but who are engaging social and environmental justice issues, and you'll find some really interesting people there.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to call on myself because I have a comment and a question. My comment is about a little town in, I believe, Mississippi called Satartia, where there was a spill of carbon dioxide from a pipeline. And I think this town had about 500 people, but they were deeply affected by this. And I'm just bringing that up to compare with the work that the externality work that you did. And it just seems to me like a place where forgotten, and what happened to the people there was really serious. And then I wanted to just simply comment that I have the impression that the pictures on the outside of the van were by you.
One of our collective members. Yeah, one of our team members.
Because it really reminded me of Intuit Art. And so I thought that was a connection. And you mentioned this place called the Fossil Fuel Cafe. And it really reminded me of Richland High School, which you might be pretty close to right now, Richland, Washington High School, where this was the center of the book called Plutopia, written by Kate Brown, and she talked about Richland in the United States and another town in Russia. And now the students at Richland High School have adopted the bomb as their mascot. And the symbol of their school is a big mushroom cloud. And their teams are called the Bombers. And
that's wrong.
I actually wanted you to comment on that, but then
that's an incredible example of an intervention on a symbol, a contested symbol, marshaling it for their side, and normalizing it to the point that it has no meaning anymore. But it's an effective strategy. That's the kind of thinking on our side that we want to develop. What does it look like for us to steal symbols and leverage them for our movements?
Yeah, there was a little girl who went to that high school who was from a town in Japan that would have been bombed if it hadn't been for the fog, and they transferred the bomb over to Nagasaki.
Oh my gosh.
And her town would have been bombed. And then she's going to school as an exchange student at Richland and seeing these symbols, and, it was very interesting. So I'm wondering if there's anybody else that would like to make a comment. Otherwise, we're going to go back to Dr. Rosenstein, and he has his hand up again. So, okay, Dr. Rosenstein, ask your question.
Oh, okay, as long as everyone else asks the first question, I don't want to preempt any other people who have. You
Well,
mentioned
there's
okay.
nobody asking right now, so.
Okay. You mentioned something which intrigued me in one of your responses of how you were responding to the petrochemical complex, maybe in the Cancer Alley, in dealing with protest movement. I know they've enacted some legislation which makes protestation illegal and imposes harsh jail sentences on protesters. But the other thing I'm concerned about two other things about the environmental justice movement. Number one, the Supreme Court annulling some of our laws that help us mitigate climate change, like West Virginia versus EPA, where they restricted the ability of the EPA to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions. And secondly, their latest provision where they have prevented us from treating any pollutants which are not runoff in streams. If there's anything in between streams and runoff, we no longer legally can treat them. What do we do? And then, of course, another thing on the horizon is that the person who may be elected president, Donald Trump, has made his first provision, drill, baby, drill. So I think those are stark challenges to the environmental justice movement, and how do we deal with them in a forthright way that preserves our constitutional framework?
Yeah, Ari, good question. It's scary. There's a huge rollback on all kinds of legislation designed to protect us and make our society just. And we don't have powerful movements to counter that. So the left is not in a great place. It hasn't been for some time. And that, that's where, I think we're challenging a couple of things. One is, for many decades, academia and activism have been locked in this critique posture. But what comes afterwards, right? What's next? So an institutional critique is what I mean. So, that was a question we were kind of posing and experimenting with our interventions in the museum sector was, what does it look like to move from institutional critique to institutional liberation? We're kind of less invested now in trying to change other museums versus, like modeling and using our skills, as a different kind of museum. But that sort of anti-institutional ethos has facilitated, it hasn't caused it, but it's facilitated the neoliberal evisceration of so many of our societal institutions, which is why they're failing us, budget cuts, et cetera. And also for the longest time, I think this has changed a lot, but radical movement energy did not go into the electoral sphere. And fortunately, I think we're seeing some, frankly, anti-establishment folks who are awesome and resonating with the American public and regular people, because they're saying this system doesn't work for us. This is why Trump built his base. Who's saying that on the left? There are some, but the Democratic Party keeps sidelining them. And then we see the radical right and fringe, like the Republican Party can't sideline them because they're playing hardball and they're transforming the party and they're transforming the country. So I think we have to kind of wake up a little bit. And when we see the insurgents within institutions, they need our support.
There's one thing that came up in an institution some years ago that still bothers me today. The Museum of Science and Industry had some spokespersons at the American Chemical Society meeting, and I brought up a question about they have a coal mine there, which is one of the big exhibits at that Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago. And I was asking them how they connect this, still having the coal mine exhibit with the environmental movement, where we have to show people we have to get off the fossil fuel binge. But if you still continue to just have that coal mine exhibit as is, it just ingrains us into further fossil fuel usage. So I think they did not answer that question at that time, and I haven't seen anything the museum has done since then to deal with that specific issue.
Well, now it's 8:30 or even beyond. And even if we go on to 2 hours, we've only got 20 minutes. And it's, Beka, it's your call if you want to continue, because this program generally lasts for an hour and a half, but we'll go on as long as you have energy and feel like it.
Well, I see a couple more hands, so why don't we entertain those hands and then call it at that.
Okay, so I'm going to call on David Silverman and then David Kraft, and I still have something I want to ask, so I'll be probably last. Go ahead, David Silverman.
Thank you. And I appreciate and enjoy this very much. Thank you. A couple of points and a question. On the environmental justice front, I'm wondering, well, first of all, for those that are interested in understanding how EPA is doing this, there's an environmental justice map that they have available that will drill down to the census tract level, which means that you can find out where in your community there are qualifying organizations and communities. And that's really important because that's where there's an opportunity to raise up folks, partner with them, and they will be taking the lead because they have to be partnered in order to plug into those funding hubs that have emerged. Blacks and Green is doing the first tens of millions of dollars training and outreach on this in the next week or two, next weekend actually. And so if people want to plug into this in a way where there's that level of alliance and resource, I say this in part because Blacks and Green and many of these folks have both a very positive and arts-driven and curatorial vision. What they're doing with the Emmett Till House that goes way beyond some of the other sorts of environmental activism we may be familiar with. And those sort of partnerships are happening right now. So I wasn't clear that what I was hearing from folks or from you that there were how to build those bridges now. And that would be a question for you. The second thing I just wanted to comment was, I know in the environmental educator community now, there is an organizational effort to establish museum environmental education literacy by leadership across the curatorial profession. And I'll try to connect you with some of the folks I know in the Environmental Educators Association. I suspect you've got lots to contribute and may find some allies there. But that alliance building question in this present moment about some of the visions that are emerging, I'm curious what you think of that.
Yeah, I think Queens Museum in New York, which is where we launched our project, where we launched the Natural History Museum, it was the first museum, I don't think I'm misspeaking, the first museum to hire a full-time community organizer. And I don't understand why every single museum doesn't do that. We need to build and serve communities. And I think that is happening a little more now in the museum space. And I also feel like something I learned over the years of doing this is like that we have more, like these institutions are more porous than we understand them to be. We are important to them. And I mean, this is true also of like local politics. Like if you show up, you and start to build those relationships, you actually have a lot of influence. You have more power than you may believe. And then it's just a question of more people showing up. So I do think that those collaborations and those alliances are super important. And also just like the sort of cross-disciplinary nature of having artists collaborating with communities, with scientists, with organizations. Everybody's looking at something from different angles. And there's a difference between like conceptualizing everything and like hiring an artist at the end to make it look pretty versus having these different perspectives and ways of thinking at the table from the beginning.
Okay, your answers are just wonderful. Okay, Dave, you want to ask your question?
This will be a quick one. I think it was Mark Twain who said, against the onslaught of humor, nothing can stand. And I'm just curious, what's your experience been, or have you utilized things like over-the-top satire, irony, absurdity to really get your point across? And I mean, one of the things I've found with, over 40 years of our activism is what a horrible sense of humor we have. In fact, we have none. We're really so goddamn grim all the time, and so anyway, just wanted to throw that out because there is an art to humor. So take it away.
There is an art to humor, but it's, I'll use my daughter's language, cringy, if it's not good, if it's not really well executed, right? And I think it's very hard to leverage humor for the layperson to leverage humor in an effective way. It's not impossible, but I see it done poorly more often than I see it done well. And I'll say, we've done stuff in our past that was a little more on the humor end of things. But we weren't very good at it. And also, I think, there's folks like the Yes Men. There's plenty of people who I think can do really brilliant interventions. I heard Jon Stewart is coming back with The Daily Show in the lead up to the election this year. There's another one. But the political theater that is kind of over the top, or in particular that makes fun of the opposition or the big corporate target or what have you, I think tends to reify their power sometimes. And also, perhaps is really speaking just to the choir. I don't know how many folks with our street theater we're winning over. So for us, we really leaned much more in the direction of authenticity and communicating power. Like how can we make choices that that turn the tables and don't reify this dynamic of us below and them up there, but rather like puff up our feathers and in really sincere, authentic, and powerful ways. I'll say just one thing. I was telling my mom over dinner, we were talking about in Standing Rock, when things were, getting very intense there, and the veterans showed up. U.S. military veterans showed up and there was a ceremony where a number of them wore uniforms from like 100 years ago and got on their knees and apologized and asked for forgiveness. And it was incredibly powerful for not just everybody in the room and for the tribal folks I've spoken with, but for the rest of us around the world who bore witness to that.
Recently, there have been 2 episodes of Democracy Now! One of them spent the entire hour talking about artists who had established installations. The main one she talked about was at the University of Indiana, and the artist had gotten the contract 3 years ago and worked on it for 3 years and was ready to put it up when they canceled on her. And then Ai Weiwei was on, I think, yesterday or the day before, and he's gotten canceled. These cancellations were caused by the artists taking a stand in favor of freedom for Palestine. And I really would like you to comment on that if you don't mind. And then Ace Hoffman has put something in the chat that I'd either like to read or have him read. So comment on these cancellations, and then let's go to Ace.
Yeah, gosh, for a country that calls itself a democracy, we sure don't create a lot of space for perspectives that are not accepted as the norm. And also museums are repositories of and archives of genocide. That you go to natural history museums and that is a body of evidence. And I know I was speaking with an Indigenous collaborator a couple of days ago who was saying that she does not know one Indigenous person here in the US that she has spoken with that has not, witnessed the war on Gaza in Israel and not felt like it brought up for them their own histories here. And museums and the art world, there is this history. On the one hand, artists can say controversial things that are not, acceptable yet, and they have done that throughout history. On the other hand, museums and art institutions also do have a history of censorship. When those things happen, they can be leveraged. For some artists, for us, we've actually thought about campaigns or projects in the past where we're like, how can we push this, and and then blow it up into a story. That can be something that, Ai Weiwei has a platform and he didn't need that exhibition to go on to use it.
Yeah. And introducing Ace, I wanted to say that he has done artwork and did a whole self-published book, which I bought a long time ago, and it's really nice. So Ace, would you mind just saying something?
Oh, hi, I don't know. Can you hear me?
Oh,
I have a
easy.
new system.
Yeah, very good.
Okay, good. Yeah. Well, I just wanted to mention that after 3 Mile Island, as I wrote in the chat, I had a comedy routine about it that was played on the Dr. Demento show. So it is possible to do comedy about this stuff. And I also posted it on YouTube if anyone wants to listen to it. It's only 2 minutes long.
Okay, okay, thanks.
That was it.
I'm copying that link. Thank you. I grew up on Dr. Demento, so I look forward to seeing that.
So did,
Oh,
so
you
did
might
my
have heard
children. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, great.
Fish heads, roly-poly fish heads.
How about the elephant duty?
So
Oh,
good.
let's go. Okay, now I'm wondering, okay, I believe we are at the end here, and so I need to turn this back to Dave, unless there's some ends that people want to pick up. And so actually, I'm going to put the responsibility for ending it on Dave. Go ahead, Dave, please.
Okay, Jan, thank you. Beka, I don't think thank you comes close enough to convey the appreciation I have for you being with us tonight. This was a different direction for this kind of a program, but it was sorely needed, and not just here, but elsewhere. So thank you, and we'll work out another way of saying it that really gets to the core. Also, I'll ask if you would stay a few minutes after we shut down, discuss some things. Now some housekeeping. I want you all to know that we have saved the chat. We always do. And I will send the chat out to everyone who attended here tonight. We're going to do our best to get this one up on YouTube as quickly as possible as well. So you can look forward to that, and we'll get the link sent out at a later date on that one as well. Next month, February 25th, I believe. Nope, 29th. We will have Joshua Frank, who is an author, who will be our guest on Night with the Experts. He wrote a book about the Hanford Reservation, among other things. So he'll be with us next week.
And he's managing editor at Counterpunch.
Counterpunch. That same one. All right. Well, thank you all for joining us tonight. Beka, again, thank you. And we hope to see many of you back next time, especially you newbies who showed up for the first time tonight. We hope you join us again. And if you have any questions, get them in the chat now. We'll try and get the information back to you. And you'll also find in the chat that Beka left the contact for the Natural History Museum page, so you can contact her through that. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for joining us, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming.
Good night, everyone.
Thank you very much. It was wonderful.